Hi, my name's Fiona Murray and I am the Finance Manager for Fellow Traveller Games, Double Jump Communications and the Treasure Hunters Fan Club. I've been working in this capacity for about 8 years, since the founding of Surprise Attack, which is the registered entity for all these companies, and until a few years ago I was completely self-taught. So I feel like I'm qualified to tell you that while sometimes accounting feels equal parts mind-numbingly dry and terrifying, it can also be like a cool puzzle to be solved. And once you understand a few basics, it does get easier. I know keeping your books in order is probably the last thing you want to have to deal with when you're starting out in the industry, but whatever capacity you end up working in, some basic financial literacy will be necessary. So I'm here to hopefully demystify things for you a bit and take you through a few elements that you're most likely to need as you begin your career in games. Before I go on, I do need to make the disclaimer that this information may or may not be suitable for your particular circumstances, and it is important to engage an accountant to advise you. But if you have an understanding of the basics, there are plenty of things you can do to keep your books in order and make your accountant's life easier. I'm going to cover two major topics today, one that you're likely to need quite early on and one that you can look forward to a little bit further down the track when you're looking to release a game. The first thing I'm going to cover is something that I see a lot of early career folks struggle with, which is the first steps basically, getting started and creating a proper tax invoice. As you enter the industry, you're likely to work on a contract basis at some point, and this involves registering an Australian business number, or ABN, as a sole trader. An ABN is like your tax file number, but for a business you've registered instead of for an individual. It's a unique 11-digit number that identifies you as a registered business, and if you do any contract work with an Australian company, you will need one. Because if you submit an invoice without an ABN to an Australian company, they legally have to withhold 47% of its value and remit that to the ATO on your behalf. It basically means that you're paying a ridiculous amount of tax, and you definitely do not want that. You can apply for an ABN via the Australian Business Register's website, abr.gov.au. And if you're just starting out as a contractor, it's best to apply as a sole trader in your own name. If you're planning on taking the leap and starting your own studio, for starters, congratulations, that's huge. You'll need to apply as a company, but that process is kind of big and scary, so it's best to go through it with the help of an accountant, so I'm going to skip over that one today. So we've established that you're hired to work on a contract basis. You'll need to provide a tax invoice that includes your ABN in order to get paid. Now there are a few rules on what information must be included in a proper tax invoice, and these differ slightly depending on whether the amount being invoiced is above or below $1,000. But I think it's best to have too much info rather than not enough. So I'm going to take you through the requirements you need to make a template that you can use regardless of the invoiced amount. So this is a template that I put together a while ago because I was receiving a lot of invoices from suppliers who weren't necessarily familiar with the invoicing process. So I thought it might be helpful to have a template on hand that I could flick their way just so that they could fill it out and have an easier time of it. So I'm going to use this template to take you through the requirements for a proper tax invoice. Okay. The first step is that the document must feature the words tax invoice, just somewhere, anywhere. Next up is your business name, your address and your ABN. Your business name will be just whatever name you've registered your ABN in. And also you will need the business name, address and ABN of the recipient of the invoice. I've used our own info here just for this example. So Surprise Attack Pty Ltd is the legal entity that our ABN is registered as, and this is an invoice that's going out on behalf of Double Jump communications. So the T/A stands for trading as. You might also see DBA on invoices, which stands for doing business as, and it's basically just differentiating the legal entity which the invoice has to have and also the trading name that we've chosen to use. We've got our address, which you can see, we're just out at the arcade, and our ABN. You'll need the date that you're creating the invoice. Now this is a brief description of the services or items you are providing. So I've set it out in two different ways here as two different examples. The first is just a simple, like just a single lump sum. So this is, for example, say a month's worth of contract work. So you'd have the quantity of one and the agreed upon price for the month, or a second way to lay it out would be the quantity represents hours and then the unit price represents your hourly rate for the same total. I'm going to stop here and just point out that for the purposes of this exercise, stuff is always easier to deal with in lots of 10. This in no way represents a acceptable or healthy hourly rate. Please don't agree to work for anyone for $10 an hour, ever, for anyone. It's quite illegal. So yes. Next up, we have the GST amount. Now, the way this works is that if your business or enterprise has a turnover of $75,000 or more, you must register for GST and apply 10% GST to all your invoices. If your turnover is less than this, and that's likely to be the case if you're just starting out, then you do not need to charge GST, but you do need to make a reference to it in your invoice to indicate that none is being charged. I see a lot of people who are new to this adding 10% GST by default because they just think that's how it works, which is fair enough if no one's ever told them any different. So as you can see here, we've got the GST and then just nil, so it's not affecting the total in any way. Now next up we have the invoice reference number. Now this is more for your reference than anything else. It's not necessarily a legal requirement of a tax invoice. It's best to come up with a naming convention that works for you, so you can keep track of things, especially if you're freelancing and you have a lot of multiple clients on the go at once. It'll help you keep your payments straight. Personally, I like to use an abbreviation of the client's name and a number. For example, Bungie is a client of Double Jumps at the moment, so I've abbreviated their name to BNG, followed by a 3-digit number, so 001. BNG 001, BNG 002, etc. You could use a reference to the month or the date, but I tend to use numbers because we often have multiple projects on the go per client. Again, if you're freelancing, you might have this. So it's not necessarily going to be a case of one single invoice per client per month. So that's why I prefer to do it that way. If you can pick a good convention and keep all of your invoices straight using it, your accountants will super love you for it, I promise. Next up, we have bank info so that your client knows where to send you cash. You would be surprised how many times I've had an invoice with no bank info or any payment method on it. So it's an easy thing to overlook if you're new to this, so definitely remember to include it. You should use just a regular bank account, so whatever one you're using for your business. If you're a sole trader, you're probably going to be using just your regular personal bank account. I know a lot of people like to get paid via PayPal, but you'll find probably that a lot of companies, especially sort of bigger ones, won't want to pay into a PayPal account. They would prefer to pay into a regular bank account. If you do get lucky and find someone who is happy to pay into your PayPal account, just remember that PayPal will take fees on that transaction from you, and those fees are on you, not the client, so just something to factor in there. Okay, there's something that I haven't added to this invoice, but you still need to consider, and that's due dates. So you want to decide on your payment terms as a business. It's common for most people to request 14 or 30 days to get paid in, but you also need to be aware that this is a bit of a balancing act between you and your client, because a lot of companies, especially larger ones, will have their own payment cycles, and they'll only have certain dates or so many times a month that they can pay, which may not necessarily align with your due date. Your best bet is to check with the client in advance what their payment cycles are, so when you can expect to get paid, or how soon after your invoice you can expect to get paid. It's important not to be afraid to follow up with clients if they have not paid you by the date that they said they would, and follow up again and again, and seriously, don't be afraid to keep following up with them. It took me years to get over the fear of hassling people for money, and that is like 30% of my job. So don't be afraid to just keep on people to get paid. And that is about it for proper tax invoices. There are tools that you can use to keep your books in order and track everything. Um, online tools like Xero, QuickBooks, MYOB. Honestly, they all kind of drive the same. So once you've figured out how to use one, like the rest of them are much of a muchness. You can even keep tracking things via spreadsheets if you must, but the goal here is to keep everything organized and accounted for, so that when your accountant steps in to do your tax at tax time, they'll have an easier time of it. Now I'm going to jump ahead a bit career-wise to something you're going to need when you're looking to release a game, which is how to interpret a store sales report. Now, these are super daunting when you're first starting out. There is a lot of assumed knowledge, and there's no easy set of instructions explaining anything, so they're quite a bit to get used to. Every store does things just a little bit differently, and in some cases, like Sony, the same store does things completely differently depending on what region you're dealing with. It's kind of like a foreign language, but then within that, each individual store has its own dialect. When Fellow Traveller, or then as we were known, Surprise Attack Games, was starting out, I went through hell trying to learn how to interpret these. So I'm very happy for this opportunity to hopefully be able to demystify the process a bit and save you some pain. In this example, I'm going to use a Steam report and just point out the major figures that you need to recognize, but then once you know what you're looking for, you should be able to apply this knowledge to reports from other stores as well. So this is quite an old example from way back in the Surprise Attack Games days when we were just starting out. This is probably one of our first few Steam reports like ever. You can see I've redacted a bit of info. The big chunk of black that's slightly obscured by my webcam feed is where you'll see the titles of your games that are for sale. So this report becomes available in the report section of Steamworks, usually sometime around the 25th of the following month. Date's redacted, but I'm going to tell you this is July. It's a July report, so in this example, you'd expect to get this report around the 25th of August, give or take, and then payment would be made by Valve pretty much at the end of August. Now you need to note that 30 days plus is a pretty common timeline to receive payment from stores, so you definitely need to factor this into your cash flow planning. Unfortunately, it's not a case of the month finishing and then Steam throwing the money at you. It actually takes them quite a while to sort of sort everything out and get the reports up and get everyone paid. So first up, We have our net units sold, which is basically the gross units sold minus the chargebacks and returns. You can see we luckily didn't actually have any this month, but yeah. And then we have the gross revenue, which is basically all of the money that's come in before we start dealing with things like sales tax and Steam cuts. So it's just all the money. So next we have our VAT or sales tax. So this represents the various sales taxes from all over the world, like any country's local tax. It's all boiled down here, such as like US sales tax or Australian GST. So Valve takes all of these taxes, separates it from the money that you get paid based on, and they remit all of that tax to the various tax authorities in all the various countries. So you don't have to, which is awesome, because I cannot imagine how complex that would be. So after we take away the VAT, we're left with the net Steam sales, and I make a point of this number because if you released your game in Unreal and you need to calculate your 5% to pay Epic, this is the number that you're going to use to calculate your 5%. So after all that, this is what we're left with. After Steam has taken its 30% cut, you'll note that the net Steam sales total, if you compare that, so the revenue share total is 70% of that number, so you know that that's it's a good way to just double check that the cut's right. Steam also make a point of showing you how much of that came from the US for reasons, but the total is what we're interested in. So that means that we're left with $1,747.83. So that's what we can expect to receive from Steam, right? Not quite. So here's where it gets a little tricky. This is foreign withholding tax. Foreign withholding tax is something that's completely unrelated to the VAT and the sales tax from the previous section. And this exists because of an income tax treaty between Australia and most other countries of the world. This ensures that your income is only subject to tax once, instead of being taxed by the country it's coming from and then being taxed again by Australia. So these amounts withheld, and that'll happen every month, these can actually be claimed back as a credit against tax on profits in your tax return. So absolutely, definitely keep track of these amounts and give the info to your accountant at tax time, and they'll be able to apply that as a tax credit on any profits you make. Otherwise, you're just leaving money on the table. Come on. Now that we've established the total amount owing and the amount of withholding tax, which you are definitely taking note of and tracking, this leaves us with the amount that we can expect to receive from Steam. Now this is a USD amount, and Steam and most other stores will pay out in USD. So if you give them an Australian bank account, whatever they send you will be converted to AUD by your bank. Now, you may want to set up a USD bank account because of this, so that you're not quite so at the mercy of sort of what the exchange rates are doing, and you can exchange that money to AUD, at a time of your own choosing. Talk to your accountant or your bank about this. They'll be able to advise you through that process. Also be aware that while most stores will pay in USD, Apple, Nintendo, and Google Play will only pay developers in their local currency, so you'll need to provide them with an AUD bank account. And that's about all I have for you today. Thank you for listening. Speaking of Apple, I'm going to leave you with one more little tidbit that drove me up the wall before I found out about it, which is that Apple takes a $25 fee from all payments to developers, and I have yet to find anywhere where they actually make mention of this. So if your payment from Apple is off by about 25, that is why. You're welcome. And thank you.